Welcome to Europe Chats. We are in June 2023. In the second half of this year, the European Union will need to take important decisions on the next steps in the process of its enlargement. Ukraine and Moldova are making big efforts to qualify for the opening of accession negotiations. Citizens of Georgia have been standing up for the country's European future, hoping for Georgia to move from a potential candidate to candidate status. In the Western Balkans, accession negotiations are ongoing with 4 countries, but progress is mixed. I will have the privilege to discuss these topics today with Professor Frank Schimmelpfennig, a leading European expert on enlargement, democratization, and on different ways in which different countries can participate in European integration. Frank is a professor at ETH Zurich and a leading protagonist of many European research projects. His most recent co-authored book on integration and differentiation in the European Union was published just in 2022. Hello, Frank.
Hello, Mariam.
Should the EU open accession negotiations with Ukraine and Moldova already this year?
Yes, I think it should, and it should do so for mainly 2 reasons. One is it would be a signal of the credible commitment of the European Union to the enlargement process. The decision that was taken last year to give the association trio a membership perspective and to grant Ukraine and Moldova candidate status, that was an important change in the EU's strategy. But candidate status is more or less a symbolic gesture. Now, opening accession negotiations would show that the European Union is really committed to the process. It also, adds, institutional weight behind this decision. So it would basically start the concrete negotiations on joining. It would strengthen also the support that Ukraine and Moldova and maybe others would receive in the process. It would basically demonstrate that the EU is serious and that it gets its institutional machinery going on this issue. At the same time, I think it's important that accession negotiations are basically open-ended and flexible. So they give the European Union the opportunity to observe the candidates, how they behave, how they comply with the conditions, how also democracy develops in these countries. And it preserves also the conditionality of the process. It's not a foregone conclusion, but it shows the commitment of the European Union.
Well, speaking about conditionality and reversibility of the process, the European Union actually updated its methodology in 2020, mainly to integrate Western Balkans, to reinvigorate the accession process of them. Is a further reform of the enlargement actually foreseen or necessary in order to integrate Ukraine?
Well, I think it's important to say that this has been one reform of the enlargement strategy in a long series of reforms since the mid-2000s. And it's also important to understand that most of these reforms have not really gained traction for the enlargement process. So I think the specific methodology of the enlargement strategy is really a secondary concern. So why hasn't it gained traction before? Because I think the political fundamentals weren't right. Since the mid-2000s, we've observed widespread enlargement fatigue. Public opinion turned away from the enlargement process. Also, there wasn't a general commitment of the member states to the process, who thought that maybe the EU had already gone too far in enlargement, rather than a common strategic vision. We've seen all kinds of bilateral conflicts impeding the process, and so whatever the EU tinkered with in the enlargement strategy didn't really matter much if the political fundamentals are not right. Now this has changed. So now we clearly have a strong wave of solidarity with Ukraine, also with Moldova. There's a perception of a common threat. So that has, to some extent, sidelined this enlargement fatigue. It has also helped to overcome these bilateral issues, that some of the old member states have with the candidates. So I think this has really gotten the political fundamentals right.
Frank, you often mention that EU needs to be credible in its offer of future membership in order for the enlargement strategy to be a successful policy tool. But can the EU really be credible? Because it has actually officially inserted in the Copenhagen criteria a reference to the so-called absorption capacity. What does absorption capacity actually mean? Is it an objective criterion? Is it measurable? Is it actually maybe a political statement, an excuse that potentially can be easily abused by populists?
Yes, sure. But first of all, I want to say that there's no opposition between absorption capacity and credibility. I think we need to understand, for the enlargement process to be credible, there needs to be the perception among the member states and among citizens in the member states that the EU is actually able to handle the enlargement process and that it has the capacity to successfully integrate new member states. If that perception is not there, there will not be public support and political support for the enlargement process. Now, you're right. The term absorption capacity, that is a political and ill-defined term, and it has been used by all kinds of political actors in their way. I mean, we know that kind of use of absorption capacity from domestic debates on immigration as well, where it's also not clear, okay, when is the boat full or when is it not? So I think it's an important concern, but we need to, let's say, translate it into some kind of measurable and handable quantities. And I think it has three major dimensions. One is the decision-making capacity of the European Union. There's the concern that more member states might paralyze decision-making, which is a valid concern because more member states add more so-called veto points in the decision-making process, especially when you admit countries that have, let's say, outlier preferences in comparison with the existing membership. The second concern is the fiscal capacity of the European Union, because more member states will make demand on the EU budget, and that's especially true if the EU adds, let's say, comparatively poor, comparatively agricultural member states, because that are the biggest items in the budget, and that will definitely raise issues of capacity, because it would either require that the rich member states are ready to increase the budget, or that the current main beneficiaries are willing to share what they get with the new member states. That has been an issue in Eastern enlargement as well, and that will require some decisions. And then there's the issue of social cohesion. I mean, if as will be the case, the addition of new member states will add societies that are very different with regard to socioeconomic conditions from the current member states, that will undermine the social cohesion of the entire union, that will create migration, pressures will raise issues of identity, and I think all of this needs to be taken very seriously.
Is the EU ready to tackle these three challenges that you outlined? Also, how will the EU, in your opinion, need to reform its decision making in order to accommodate, let's say, a union of 36?
Yeah, I mean, is it ready now? No. Does it have the instruments? Yes. So of course one could say, okay, if the EU lacks the capacity to change its decision-making procedures and to, let's say, prop up its fiscal capacity, then it should do so. Yeah, it should invest. But I think that is not what is likely to happen because of the conflicts within the membership about all of these issues. But it has an instrument, and this instrument is differentiated integration, or what is now also termed staged accession or gradual accession. So I think there's a clear formula which is not new, which we've seen in earlier enlargements as well, which is, let's say, the more heterogeneous the EU becomes as a result of enlargement, the more it, let's say, uses differentiated integration to admit new member states. That means in those areas where there are the most pronounced differences between old and new member states, there is a, let's say, temporary exclusion of the new member states from full membership. And that mitigates some of the pressures of enlargement, because it means that at least for some time, the new member states will not fully participate in the policies of the EU, so the full costs will not come to bear, and that will make it easier for the old member states to admit the new ones.
Well, speaking about the staged integration, the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen recently spoke in Bratislava, and she talked about stepping up support for the Western Balkans by offering them gradual integration into the single market and an increased pre-accession funding. What do you make out of this increased ambition?
Yes, I think that's the right way to go. I think it's almost necessary. Yeah. To proceed in that way, and I think it actually adds to the credibility of the process. So it does not overburden the old member states in integrating the new ones, in having to shift massive budget transfers to the new member states. So it will be an easier sell also to domestic constituencies in the old member states. At the same time, let's say these partial intermediate rewards will also help the candidates in making these reforms, because there are intermediate benefits. I think one of the issues in the recent enlargement process was that everyone knew, okay, these are comparatively weak candidates as compared to earlier candidates, so it will be a long process. But the benefits, which are high, they will all come only at the end of the entire process. And for policymakers that face elections, that have a time horizon of, 4-6 years, say, selling hard policy reforms in the country, for which the benefits only may come in 20 years or so, that's a hard sell, and that undermines the credibility of the process. So I think it is clear that if and when enlargement comes, it will be differentiated. It will be more differentiated than it already had been in the Eastern enlargement case, because the EU is facing, poorer, less developed candidates than it had before. And I think the case of Ukraine is particularly important because it's a big country, and it's an agricultural powerhouse. And integrating Ukraine as it is now, for instance, in the common agricultural policy, would basically overburden this policy. we already see the strains now, that many of the, say, Eastern European member states who are generally in strong support of Ukraine face opposition by their farmers and have had to restrict the free import of Ukrainian agricultural goods for this reason. This is foreshadowing the kind of conflicts that we will face as the enlargement or the admission process moves on.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of differentiation, what are the costs of enlargement and the cost of non-enlargement? What will happen if the EU stopped enlarging?
Well, I think we need to understand that enlargement has never been, let's say, this kind of material cost benefit calculation policy. If it had only been about, let's say, the tangible material, economic, financial costs and benefits, I think the EU would be a lot smaller than it is today.
But I meant more generally, also in terms of security, in terms of.
I think it has always been, say, part of the historical mission of the European Union to unite the continent, to integrate countries that were willing to introduce democratic reforms, to share the values and fundamental norms of the European Union, and let's say the specific costs and benefits. These were secondary issues that you could deal with, for instance, through differentiation. So I think the costs of non-enlargement, it would be increased instability at the external borders of the European Union. We always observe that let's say the outer member states of the EU, they are usually more interested in enlargement than the inner member states, because they don't like to have external borders of the European Union. But again, we should not create any illusions here. When you enlarge, you just move the external borders of the European Union, and you often move them into areas that are even more unstable than the current ones. So I think it's a bit difficult to speak of the costs of non-enlargement, and it would also be wrong to downplay the actual costs of enlargement. But it's important to understand that basically this is a policy that derives from, let's say, the fundamental values and norms of the European Union. It's part of the core of the European project, and only when there's consensus that this is part of the historical mission will it move forward. And then it's a political decision, and I think the specific costs and benefits play a secondary role.
Well, when the European communities were created in the 1950s, they accounted for just below 6% of the world's population. Now, with the 27 new member states, the EU still accounts for just under 6% of the world's population. Now, I know that population is just one factor, but could we say that the enlargement is a necessity if the EU actually wants to remain relevant in the world?
Yes, but I think that also depends on what kind of countries the EU integrates. I think if we talked about, let's say, Swiss membership or Norwegian accession, or at some point of the future also about the reintegration of the UK into the European Union, I think these would be additions that would actually increase the economic weight and the power of the European Union. Those countries that are now candidates for membership, at least for some time, I think they will rather be an economic burden on the European Union. That might change as these countries develop long term, but immediately, it's more of an obligation of the European Union to preserve peace, bring order, help these countries stabilize and democratize, rather than increasing the power or the economic weight of the European Union.
Exactly. And the question is, does the EU still want to be a transformative power? I mean, does it want to play a similar role for current candidate countries as it played in between the 1970s and around 10 years ago for the candidate countries and new member states?
Yes, I think that hasn't changed. We've seen a slight shift in the prioritization. Yeah, so the main strategy before was, okay, these countries have to reform, they have to democratize, they have to change their rules in line with those of the European Union. And when they've done that to a certain extent, then we will offer membership, and then we will give them candidate status. And when they do even more, we will start the accession negotiations. I think now in the new geopolitical context, the EU hasn't given up on its conditions, but it has said, okay, we will start the process at a level of compliance with our rules that are lower than it was before. And we try to start the accession process when the countries are maybe less ready than in earlier enlargement rounds. But we hope that starting the accession process now will actually speed up the reform process. But we don't see that the European Union has given up this transformative strategy, and I think it shouldn't. It also cannot. Yeah, I mean, if a country wants to be a full member state, this only works if it shares the EU's liberal democratic values, and if it abides by basic institutional settings like the independence of the judiciary, the rule of law. It wouldn't be the European Union if it did not follow those rules. Again, we can say the more transformation happens, the less the EU needs differentiation, and the less countries transform on the way to membership, the more the membership will be differentiated. Again, I think this differentiated accession or staged accession is a way to take into account the level of transformation that the candidates have actually gone through.
But also, if I understand correctly, the state of the union itself, right? So the differentiation is not only about the candidate countries, it's also about the EU itself, its own decision-making, its own economic situation. Or is that really something that's totally on the side of...
Well, you could say if a candidate for membership reaches a level of transformation that puts it squarely into the fold of the old member states, there's no need for differentiation, because it will not be an extra burden on the budget. It will not wield veto power, because it has no interest in doing so. So the more a new member state transforms in a way as to become like the old member states, the less differentiation you need. The more it remains, let's say, on the margins of the membership, the more likely this needs to be accommodated by some kind of differentiation.
Well, thank you very much, Frank, for your views, for your insights, and thank you all for watching. We will be back with further episodes of Europe Chat. Stay tuned.